Dear friends, for nearly a decade, Tunisia was an inspiration to the Arab and Muslim world. It was the only democracy in the Arab world. It triggered what became very famous as the Arab Spring through its Jasmine Revolution. It inspired the Arab world to oppose dictators and try to achieve democratic transitions and democratic reforms in their countries. Unfortunately, Tunisia was the only country that came out of Arab Spring with a democracy intact. It has had two transfers of power which were peaceful, and that is enough for political scientists to conclude that Tunisia had indeed become a stable democracy. However, the last 10 years have been terrible. There are accusations of corruption. Governance has been chaotic. The economy has continued to decline. Not only because of COVID this year, but generally because of bad governance, essentially. There were a couple of incidents of terrorism in 2014 and 15, which killed the tourism industry in Tunisia. The GDP of Tunisia, at one point, 17 to 20% of it was coming from tourism. And because of the decline in tourism, Tunisian economy also tanked. So there's high unemployment, complete dissatisfaction, and Tunisian youth are sick and tired of the politics and essentially bad governance that they have experienced. So it raises many questions. The current takeover by President Kais Saied, who dissolved the parliament, assumed the powers of the Attorney General, so to speak, and is trying to rectify this, essentially has created a one-person rule again in Tunisia. But he's very popular. Nearly 84% of Tunisians support him. And it raises the question, is this the death of democracy in Tunisia? Are we seeing a return to dictatorship? But most importantly, it raises this fundamental question. Is democracy incapable of delivering good governance? We see a recession, a democratic recession worldwide. There are fewer democracies in the world today, and even those who qualify as democracies are not really as democratic as they used to be in the past. So there is a decline, global decline of democracy. But the Tunisian case really raises this issue that for impoverished societies, underdeveloped societies, what is more important, good governance or democracy? And why are democracy and good governance not always compatible? So these are some serious questions that the current, let's call it upheaval in Tunisia has raised. I will be talking to Radwan Masmoudi and Monica Marks. It is always a joy to talk to Radwan Masmoudi, who is so knowledgeable about politics in Tunisia and the Middle East in general. But unfortunately, we are talking under some very difficult circumstances for Tunisia. Radwan, what is happening in Tunisia?
Good afternoon, Muqtedar. It's a pleasure to see you again. Look, for the last 10 years, we've been working on establishing a democratic system of government in Tunisia after the so-called Arab Spring, which I don't like the terminology of Arab Spring, but after the upheavals and revolutions of 2011, we had, and I think still have, an opportunity to build a real democracy in Tunisia, and the first one in the Arab world. So we've been working very hard last 10 years on making Tunisia a democracy. I think we have succeeded on the political front. We made a lot of progress on the political front in terms of writing a constitution, establishing free and fair elections. We had, I think, 5 elections since then. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of forming organizations and political parties. So we have a lot of freedoms now in Tunisia. But I think we have failed so far on the economic front in making democracy deliver a better quality of life, better prosperity for the Tunisian citizens, and especially for young people in Tunisia who have been unemployed for many, many years and who are becoming increasingly desperate and angry and disappointed in the revolution. So there has been a lot of disappointment in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years among the population, and especially among young people. On top of that, we have this pandemic, which came about a year and a half ago, and made the situation a lot worse. The economic situation in Tunisia is really bad. Tunisia GDP has declined by about 20% in the last year and a half. Imagine, Muqtedar, that's 1/5 of the economy has vanished, 1/5. So the poor people, the lower class people, lower income people are really suffering for the last year and a half, and they have been unemployed and unable to put food on the table. So they, as a conclusion, many people, or young people in particular, are very upset, and they are not satisfied with democracy. They say, okay, we have freedom, but we can't eat. You know, what good is freedom if I cannot have food on my table to feed myself and feed my family? And I think President Kais Saied, who has no political experience, who was never involved in politics before, is just an academic, and who is also a populist. You know, he appeals to this popular anger and frustration, and he jumped on this occasion to say, I'm going to save you. I'm going to ban all these politicians. We don't want democracy if it doesn't deliver a better life, and therefore I'm going to close down the parliament, and I'm going to close down political life, you know, even the political parties. And I'm going to give you a new democracy. The new democracy that Kais Saied actually has been talking about even before becoming elected 2 years ago is a direct democracy, not a representative democracy, because he does not believe in representative democracy. He wants a direct democracy. So Kais Saied wants to change the constitution and really change completely the political system of the country. And he's using this crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, political crisis, and on top of that, health crisis, to justify basically a coup against the constitution.
We are delighted to have with us Monica Mark, who is, in my opinion, one of the most important observers of Tunisian politics for the last 10 years. She's a very distinguished scholar. She's at the moment teaching at NYU in Abu Dhabi, but she's presently in Tunis and is talking to us directly from Tunisia. So Monica, tell us what is happening in Tunisia.
So it looks like we have a rule by presidential decree at the moment, but whether that's permanent or whether the president can be contained to be seen. Right now, every day, every hour is precious. So we're finding things out as we go. But I think in many ways, the president is making things up as he goes. For those of you who are watching and haven't followed politics in Tunisia over the past week, there was one, about, 10 days ago now, 10 days, a declaration from the president, Kais Saied, that he was going to suspend the parliament for 30 days. He was going to lift parliamentary immunity for all of the MPs, and that he was going to take judicial powers into his own hands to some extent. And that's the situation that we're living in at the moment. This was, we should keep in mind, very popular on the streets. We don't have reliable opinion polls yet. And Kais Saied, the president, froze the street by banning, reimposing certain COVID-related restrictions like a 7 p.m. curfew, a ban on gatherings of over 3 people. So the street was in essence frozen. So our idea of the Tunisian street is in many ways this frozen snapshot of Sunday night, where we saw large demonstrations in favor of celebrating, even with fireworks in cities all around Tunisia, Kais Saied's actions. But we have to remember the population was primed for this by an accumulated list of injustices and frustrations that they had faced over years, which led many Tunisians to believe that the parliament was basically a useless circus, and that only radical shock therapy could deliver hope.
I was reading an article in the New York Times this morning in which the reporters say that they are talking to people on the streets, and no matter who they talk to, the answer seems to be very clear that nobody is horrified by what is happening. They're not afraid of returning to a dictatorial form of governance. Young people are constantly asking the question, what has democracy delivered to us? So it raises this very serious question, is that how come in the Tunisian case, there seems to be an incompatibility between democracy and good governance? Even before COVID, for the last 10 years, since 2011-12, the Tunisian economy is barely grown by 1.5%, and that's it. And heavily dependent on tourism. And after the terrorist attacks, the tourist industry also shrunk significantly. So there seems to be an indictment of the current bunch of politicians in Tunisia who have, become corrupt, who have become nepotistic, and who have failed to provide good governance and opportunities. And I think it's a good question. What is the point of democracy if the government is not able to provide basic public goods like jobs, safety, security, hope?
Look, I mean, I think, first of all, I don't think it's fair to call Tunisia, even before this coup, a democracy. I think we are still work in progress. I don't think we have achieved the goal of establishing a really full-fledged and functioning democracy in Tunisia. So I think we are in the process, or have been in the process, of building democracy. But I think it's not completed, and it has not been achieved. I think democratic transitions take a lot longer than 10 years. I think we are still in a democratic transition, but it has a lot of problems, and it's still work in progress, and we still don't have a fully functioning democracy. So I don't think it's fair to say that democracy has not delivered. I think we are not a democracy yet. We're building a democracy, and we are maybe 50% along that way in terms of building the democratic institutions, but there is still a lot of leftover from the previous era, and there is a lot of dysfunctional, let's say, institutions in Tunisia. So I do think that the current system has failed, as I said earlier, in terms of delivering on the promise of a better life and better economy and prosperity for Tunisians. I think that so far the political system has failed. The answer is not to go back to dictatorship. Dictatorship is worse. Dictatorship has destroyed our countries in Tunisia and in the Arab world. Dictatorship is not the answer. So what is the answer? The answer is to stick with democracy, but fix these problems. Build a real democracy, improve our democracy, improve the efficiency of our democracy. I agree with you, and I agree with all this criticism that democracy has not been efficient in Tunisia, especially the last year and a half, as I said, in terms of addressing these crises, whether on the economic front or the health problem and all that. Yes, that criticism is real and is true. The answer is not a military coup or a constitutional coup. The answer is stay with democracy, but fix democracy. Make it a better system. Make it, improve our democratic process so that we have a real system that can deliver good governance and that can deliver a better life and a better economy. And I think it's doable, even though we're not there yet.
I read Article 80 in the Tunisian constitution, and my instant reaction was, why is it there in the constitution to begin with in the first place? It is like a backdoor to dictatorship. And of course, I don't think that what the current president has done is fully consistent even with Article 80, because the Article 80 says that he has to work in in concert with the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the House, but he has dissolved the parliament. So in that sense, he's not consistent even with Article 80, and he's a professor of law. So he probably knows better than anybody else that what he has done is not consistent with Article 80. But there seemed to be that even when you were writing the Constitution, that in cases of emergency, democracy is not good, dictatorship or one-man government is good. That is a sense I got from that Article 80. And to me, it shows that even as you were writing your Constitution, you were tentative towards democracy, isn't it?
Look, writing the Constitution was not an easy process. It was a very difficult process that took 2 years of very difficult negotiations between all the members of the Constituent Assembly. I personally advocated a fully parliamentarian system, which means no president at all. We don't need a president. Just have a government selected by the parliament, and the government is in charge of the executive. Why do we need a president if we have a government that is in charge of the executive? So there were people in the Constituent Assembly. They said, no, we definitely must have a president, and the president is the guarantor of democracy, of human rights, of the Constitution. We need the president to help unite the country. We need the president. So the Constitution became a trade-off between those who are calling for a parliamentarian system and those who are calling for a presidential system. And the compromise was, okay, let's give the president some authorities, but the majority of the executive power is with the government, which is not appointed by the president. It's appointed by the parliament, which is not controlled by the president. It's controlled by the parliament. The president has some responsibilities, but mostly national security. That's the main task of the president, is national security. So that was the compromise that was in the Constitution. And part of that compromise was that, what if we have war? If in case of a war, what happens? Well, the president is the chief of staff or the head of the army, and therefore he's responsible for national security. So he can take extreme measures to defend the country in the case of war. That's what was meant actually by Article 80. And it specifically says that he cannot dissolve the parliament and he cannot dissolve the government. It says exactly the opposite. The parliament has to be in continuous session during those 30 days, meaning that the session is continuous day and night, because they have to be working together. And the government also cannot be dissolved during that crisis, because if we have a crisis, that's not a good time to dissolve the government. And that's not a good time to dissolve the parliament. So that's why I believe what Kais Saied did is definitely unconstitutional and is against the spirit of the Constitution and the specific text of the Constitution.
To me, so to me, it is clear that he is a proponent of a kind of direct democracy, isn't he? But he's also a constitutional professor, and he should recognize that what he did was not really consistent with Article 80 of the Constitution, for example. Yeah. I think he has got rid of the Constitution also in this move.
Yeah, well, it's very ironic, isn't it, that a constitutional law professor has gotten us into this situation. Some people who are sympathetic to his actions have said, well, he's a constitutional law scholar, he knows very well what he's doing, and he's a trustworthy anti-corrupt actor who we can trust is not going to extend the 30-day period and who is going to get Tunisia back toward better governance. But I think the more reliable voices, according to interviews that I've done with good sources as to what some of his former presidential advisors were saying. This is a person who it's not really clear the extent to which he does understand the Tunisian constitution. I've heard on good sources that he suggested firing all of the municipality leaders in Tunisia and all of the governors in Tunisia, and had to be told by his team that that was unconstitutional. This is kind of reminiscent of some of the conversations we used to hear around Donald Trump, right? When Donald Trump would ask his team these crazy things, like, can we bring the military out to control protesters in front of the White House? And his team would have to pull him back and say, dude, this isn't constitutional. You can't actually do this. So it seems like, Kais Saied either has a less sophisticated understanding of the Tunisian constitution than his supporters like to with. He has a rather autocratic personality and is looking for excuses to expand his grip on power, potentially in the service of what he believes is a desperately needed anti-corruption campaign, or whatever, in the real service of Tunisia. Both of those things can be true at the same time. But I don't think it's clear that I don't think it's at all clear that this is a person with a sound understanding of, let alone respect for, the limits of his own powers. And we saw this even back in March of this year on Tunisian Independence Day. Kais Saied raised some alarm bells by saying that the control of the police forces should be a presidential prerogative. Not only the military, but the police forces. So, some more astute observers were listening and thinking, maybe this person has designs on taking more power.
So
System, I don't think it's clear the extent to which that's actually democratic either. I wouldn't call it direct democracy. I would call it a vaguely reconceptualized form of local governance. But again, we have to, because he hasn't spelled it out very well. And again, we have to remember that some of these direct democracy Jamahiriya proposals in North Africa have also been paired with a hard core of presidential or unilateral power. That's certainly what Gaddafi did. And we don't have many models really for what Kais Saied wants to do. Yeah.
See, in the coming days, he will have to make some changes which have to be popular with the people. Yeah. I don't think he can provide COVID relief or economic relief. In fact, all possible international support he's going to lose at the moment right away. I don't think European Union or the US is going to give him aid or anything like that to improve the economic situation. So the only option that might be there for him is to go after the parliament itself. So he has already revoked their immunity, and so he's probably going to start prosecuting the members of the parliament who he thinks are
that's already happened.
Corrupt,
that's already happening. Yeah.
So you're going to see probably a period of purging going on in politics, right? And then after that, could there be that there could be so much damage to the Tunisian polity as such that coming back to a democratic form may not be possible? Do you think that is possible? What are you hearing on the street talking?
Absolutely. In terms of purgings, there's a real appetite amongst the population for purgings. I think that was one of the reasons why people were celebrating, because people are very aware of a pervasive atmosphere of corruption, and there's a desperation for something to change. And Kais Saied has also ginned up the population with talk about draining the because there is a huge swamp in Tunisia, and Kais Saied does seem clean. He's not like a golden toilet seat kind of guy like Donald Trump was. So there's a lot of implicit trust in him. But we've seen prosecutions starting. I mean, I hesitate to even call them prosecutions, because some of the MPs who have been arrested now that parliamentary immunity has been lifted are not only uncorrupt people by all good accounts, but they have not been arrested in accordance with any due process whatsoever. I think of the example of Yassine Ayari, an independent MP who is very well known for fighting corruption. He brought the biggest anti-corruption file against the former Prime Minister Fakfak that brought him down, that brought that Prime Minister down. And he was arrested just a few days after the announcement, Kais Saied's announcement, by plainclothes force in an unmarked van. And, they're allegedly prosecuting him. A military court is prosecuting him on the basis of a 2018 Facebook post he made insulting the military. But he was supposed to stand in court for a hearing on October 21st, and he's not allowed to do that. There's no due procedure here going on, even within the framework of an anti-democratic military trial for a civilian on the basis of a Facebook post. And, some similar questions can be raised for some of the other arrests. So if this is an anti-corruption purge that's really going to benefit your average Tunisian, that's really going to benefit the little guy. We have yet to see that. And you're starting to hear some people already raising that concern, wanting him to go after real fat cats, the real mafia families. And some people street trusting that he might be able to reform the security state so that police abuses that are happening all the time against lower level activists, this has been happening for a long time already, might stop happening to average Tunisians. But right now, we're not seeing any contraction of the security state. We're not seeing any contraction of economic mafias. Instead, we're just seeing the security state's abuses expand to include now more prominent people, like MPs, for example. So I for one think the most tragic thing about this whole situation is that a lot of the people who were out on the street protesting, creating a situation where Kais Saied could then come out and make these announcements and then cheering for him, so hopeful, are the very people whose biggest concerns, like economic corruption, are probably not going to be met. Already, we're seeing capital fear and capital flight. Kais Saied has met with Utica, the big employers association, demanding that they lower prices for consumer goods. Now, any business person who sees that situation, where the president is coming to you demanding that you lower your prices, they're not going to be putting their money in Tunisia. Or if they have a lot of money in Tunisia, they're going to start taking it away. So how that's going to help Tunisia actually reform its economy and actually deliver for people, I don't know. How arresting MPs like Yassine Ayari is going to help Tunisia fight corruption, I don't know. Tunisians are watching, they're waiting. A lot of Tunisians say, listen, you Westerners don't understand that if he becomes a dictator, we can come out on the street again. We can scale this whole thing back. We took down, we've made a lot of protests. We know how to handle this. So all of you should just back off with all of your hypochondriac hand-wringing about the situation, calling it a coup and whatnot.
But I have a question to you in your capacity as a member of El-Nahda's Politburo. And in 2011, your party had 36% of the vote, 1.5 million voters. And I was looking at the most recent elections in 2019. Your share has gone from 1.5 million to 500,000 voters, and popularity from 36% to 18-19%. So there has been tremendous decline in Al-Nahda's popularity in Tunisia. But what is also interesting is that during this period, Al-Nahda moved away from its, Islamist image to become more of a conservative democratic party, like the Christian Democrats. So my question to you is that as a party which has always been a majority, or the biggest party, never a majority, but the biggest party in Tunisia, how much responsibility does Al-Nahda bear for the dysfunction and bad governance in Tunisia for the last 10 years?
No, that's a very good question. And the problem is now most Tunisians are blaming Al-Nahda because they think Nahda is the biggest party, and Al-Nahda has been in the government, even sometimes with one minister, but was part of the government for the last 10 years. Even though Nahda never had a majority, as you pointed correctly. Right now, Nahda has only 24% of the members of parliament, less than 1/4 of the members of parliament. So the problem is people are blaming Al-Nahda, but Al-Nahda had power only for 2 years, 2012 and 2013, when they had a clear majority and the prime minister of the government was from Al-Nahda, Hamad Jbali and Ali Al-Arayeb. Those 2 years, yes, Nahda basically was responsible for whatever happened in those 2 years because she had control of the parliament and the executive branch, which is the government. After that, in 2014, as you know, Nida Tunis, which is a secular party, won the majority in parliament and won the government. Nahda was in the government or participated in the government with only one minister, in order to form a national unity government and keep the country united. That's what El-Nahda was afraid of in 2014, 2015. We need a united government or a united front to help the country. Now, I believe El-Nahda, as I said earlier, the political system has failed as a whole, and the political system has to be revised, because the current political system has given us very weak governments and very weak or mixed parliaments that are not able, to really address the needs and the problems of the people and of the country and of the economy. These weak governments and weak parliament, weak because it's divided. We have 20 parties in parliament and 20 different blocks in parliament, but nobody really is in control. Nobody really can, so most of the ministers have been independent ministers who don't belong to any party. So they don't have a vision or an agenda. You can't ask an independent person, why did you do this or not do that? He says, okay, that's my best effort, but that I tried my best. That's all he can say. So Nahda bears some of the responsibility for this failure. Of course, Nahda has been the biggest party. Even now, with only 25%, it is still the largest political party in Tunisia. But that's part of the problem. The problem is, I don't think we have political parties in Tunisia. That's the problem. We have weakened the political parties in Tunisia so much that even El-Nahda, which is the strongest one, is weak, cannot really control the government, or cannot control the parliament, or cannot really implement a program. And even its program is still very weak and very unclear, because the structure of El-Nahda is still very weak. The law on political parties in Tunisia, in my opinion, is to blame, because the law on political parties keeps political parties very, very small and very, very weak, unable to govern and unable to solve the problems of Tunisia.
So I understand that the public in general are quite happy that this has happened, and they have been quite disappointed with essentially what has been a 10-year-long failure of good governance. So basically, there has been terrible governance. There is corruption there. There is the same nepotism. So all the bad things that you can potentially find in a representative democracy, you saw that in Tunisia in the last 10 years. And apparently that a lot of people are blaming El-Nahda, which was the biggest party during this period. So is there some possibility that the president might use this opportunity to ban El-Nahda or ban people from the older regime and the Islamist-leaning parties, and then create a smaller political arena where, parties which are neither connected to the old regime nor connected to Nahda are able to participate?
Yeah, I think there is that risk. I think that's on the menu of options right now, and something we should be watching very closely for. Just to go back to when you said that a lot of Tunisians are blaming the current situation on El-Nahda. I think for most Tunisians on the street level, for your average person in Tunisia, they're really fed up with all of the political elites, with all of the parties. The idea is that they all have been self-interested fat cats in parliament in Tunis and haven't really delivered any tangible change on the ground. And that's not entirely fair, but it's very understandable why a lot of people are so frustrated. All governments since, I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, El-Nahda has been the only political party that's been in all governments since the revolution 10 years ago. So of course, El-Nahda has tied its wagon to the successes, but unfortunately mainly failures of all of those governments. Now, for Kais Saied, this is a person who is extremely skeptical of political parties and of, I think, parliament as an institution. He's not deeply invested in the idea of multi-party democracy as a system that can, at the parliamentary level, solve Tunisia's problems. A lot of his ideas are reminiscent of the way that Gaddafi in the 70s and 80s was talking about hizbiyah. In other words, like political party as something extremely dangerous. So, some people say that it seems sometimes when they listen to Saied, like he wants to create a Jamahiriya Tunisia, a new kind of like embedding some Gaddafi ideas in this radical conception of local governance that doesn't seem very democratic and it's not clear how that would or would not include political parties. So we're dealing with somebody who has a pre-existing animosity towards parties themselves and parliamentary governance. And the one political party, the one institution really that is standing strongly against Kais Saied's proposed solutions, what his solutions might look like. It's not clear yet, but that might look like a referendum to change the constitution and have a presidential system in which become president into some form of liberalized autocracy that's a presidential system. Ennahda is the one party that's standing kind of in the middle of that. So it's an obstacle for Kais Saied. And it's possible that he might want to remove Ennahda as an obstacle, perhaps by trying to lure it into street violence, or pin a label of terrorism on it to find an excuse to do that. That's possible. It's possible.
Rashid Ghannouchi has called for a dialogue. I think you had a national dialogue for many years while this system. In fact, I attended a few of those meetings, if you remember, in the early years. I was in Tunisia then and participated, listened to a presentation by Ghannouchi and talked with him about it. But I think that if you have a dictatorship for 2 to 3 years, it's going to be difficult to go back to democratic reforms. But it is very clear from our conversation that Tunisia, as it existed before this particular takeover, was not sustainable, really. So what you need is perhaps a period of revisiting all the political failures of the past 10 years, and actually ask the question, our experiment with democracy, where did it fail? And then to basically redesign the system. That's what you're saying. You need to reboot Tunisia, right? We basically need to reboot Tunisia in the political system. But you have this additional challenge of trying to do that while trying to also ensure that the economy doesn't go further down, because the president with focus on political reforms may not focus on economic reforms. I hope if he's smart, he will first focus on economic reforms and then go after, political changes. So I think the future looks very precarious and dangerous for Tunisia. And do you have any ideas, like what would be the 2 most important things you would like to see happen like this, which could help Tunisia get back?
Yeah, I don't have a magic wand. I don't think there is a way or something that we can do immediately and see immediate results in terms of economic growth and prosperity and all that. What I do have is a plan of action that I think will work. After a year or 2 or perhaps 3 years, we can see economic growth and prosperity. So my plan or my plan of action and the suggested plan of action is, first of all, we need to protect our democracy. We cannot allow dictatorship to come back under Kais Saied or anybody else. We have to protect the institutions of democracy now, and that therefore we have to stop this coup now. It cannot continue, not for 2 or 3 years, as you mentioned, not even for 2 or 3 months. It cannot continue. We have to stop it right now. And I think there is huge pressure on Kais Saied internationally and domestically. And I think he's already starting to relent. So the first thing we need to focus on is stopping this nonsense. And one way to do that is not get, make sure that it stays peaceful, not get into any kind of violent confrontation with the police or the military or between Tunisian citizens. That's what we are trying to avoid right now at any cost. And alhamdulillah, we have succeeded in that. There hasn't been any violence, and there hasn't been a lot of arrests. So we're trying to de-escalate and keep things cool and down, and then negotiate with the president and convince him to reopen the parliament. We cannot have a government without a parliament because we have a parliamentarian system. This is what the law is, and this is what the constitution is. We will not let Kais Saied represent the whole government. He represents the presidency, and he has a role to play as the president, but he cannot also be the parliament and the government. So we have to reopen the parliament as quickly as possible. I mean, this week or next week, not even in 1 month or 2 months. And I think it's possible and it's doable, and I think it will happen. After that, we need a national dialogue to bring all the sides together and agree on how to solve all these problems, but specifically how to solve the economic problem. We had a national dialogue in the past that focused on the political issues and the political questions, and it worked very well. And it kept Tunisia democratic and safe and peaceful and all that. But we never had the similar dialogue on the economy. And what does it take to boost our economy? What kind of changes do we have to make sure that Tunisia becomes prosperous and competitive economically and can achieve real growth?
This is my last question to you. You know, I'm a Delawarean, and all Delawareans have this secret method of communicating with President Biden. So what message should we take to President Biden? What can the international community, what can the US do for Tunisia at this moment?
Thank you very much for that question. It's, of course, there is a lot that the US administration can do and that the Biden administration can do. They really have invested a lot in Tunisia in the last 10 years to support the nascent democracy of Tunisia. And we are all proud, not just as Tunisian, as Arab and Muslim, we are proud of this successful, even if partially successful, democratic process and democratic transition in Tunisia. So President Biden needs to stand with Tunisia, needs to support Tunisia economically, politically, health-wise, needs to give more attention and more support to this democracy. Why? Because if democracy is successful in Tunisia, it will impact Libya as well. It will impact the whole region. We will have the whole region transformed into a democratic region rather than a region ruled by dictators. So I think President Biden needs to send a very clear message to President Kais Saied and also to the Tunisian military that we will not, we demand a quick restoration of democracy in Tunisia. Not in 1 year or 2 years, because as you also said, it will be too late. It has to be done now. We have to have a quick restoration of democracy. If democracy fails in Tunisia, I think it will send a very, very bad message to not only Tunisians, but people across the Arab region and the Arab world that, forget about democracy, live under dictatorship and be happy that you have food to eat and that you're not hungry, but don't speak up, don't criticize, don't try to improve anything because you can't. In a dictatorship, you cannot criticize or improve anything. That would be a very, very dangerous message, I think, to send, not only to Tunisians, but to the Arab world and maybe to Muslims all over the world.
I agree. Tunisia may not be too big to fail, but it is too important to fail. So thank you very much for talking to me so candidly, Radwan. And I wish you and your country all the best.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you again, and I hope we can have coffee sometime soon.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.